a question and answer section, so you will be able to unmute yourself. I see that all of our speakers are on the line. Feel free to turn on your video if you're one of the presenters. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Leticia Peguero, the Executive Director of the Andrews Family Fund.
And if you want to say hi, folks, you can also turn your video on. Even if you're not presenting, we like to see who's on the line. So hi, everyone. Like Manuela said, I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Andrews Family Fund with this great team that you will either see and or hear and or meet throughout our time together. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us, for spending a little time this Tuesday with us for the second of our learning sessions, and just give just a very quick background as to why we decided to invite our community to do these with us. So one was to highlight the issues that we care about, the issues that we think are really impacting the lives of the young people that we work on behalf of the communities that we care about and that we are all a part of. So creating an opportunity for us to have discussion, but really to highlight the issues. What are the issues and how do they show up in communities, so that it isn't just a theoretical conversation, in this case about the intersection of immigration, detention, and juvenile justice, right? How do we understand the way that it lives in the lives of everyday young people? One of the things that philanthropy actually does really well, I know there's lots of critique. If you love a thing, critique it, of philanthropy. But one of the things that we actually do very well is we can convene, right? We have a great convening power, and this is an experiment. How do we convene people virtually from across the country to learn and to be in community together? So that was the other reason that we decided to do this. And then I would say really importantly, the third reason is to help inform our work, right? So oftentimes philanthropy works in isolation of the communities that they're working on behalf of and are trying to impact. And this is an opportunity to hear from the experts doing this work, and hopefully to help inform the way that we think, the way that we write, who we fund, how we fund. And so really excited to have you join us. And then lastly, those that talk to me all the time will probably have heard me say this, is that this is, I think, for us, an opportunity to use our radical imagination to think of what do we want the world to look like. So we oftentimes hear that the right wing has decided that they know what the world that they want to fund, that they want, what do they want that to look like. And I think hearing from experts and hearing from people that are doing the work every day allows us to use a little bit of radical imagination and think about how do we want to transform the communities that we're a part of, that we work on behalf of, that we care about, and what might that world look like as we hear from the people that are doing the work every day. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Manuela, and let's get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Leticia. And once again, welcome everyone. We want to encourage you to type in your name and your organization into the chat box as a way to say hello to each other during this really beautiful sunny lunch hour in New York City. And also share one reason why you joined, or one thing you're hoping to learn from our presenters in the collective community. So even if some of the presenters don't have this information, potentially some of the participants may have. So feel free to use the chat box as our circle, our learning circle in the community. So I'll get started and I'll share with you a little bit about the specific issue that we're hoping to address, and then some of the a little bit about the format of our learning session, as well as some additional resources. So basically, we want to just kind of hold space for the fact that we're here to explore the intersection between juvenile justice and immigrant justice, right? And according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, an estimated 11 million people are living in the U.S. without documentation, and more than 5 million children are currently living with at least one parent that does not have citizenship and legal documentation. We are the nation with the highest incarceration rate in the world, and we are all well aware that our nation has an over-reliance on the use of punishment and incarceration to address social challenges. We maintain the world's largest immigration detention system, where we're focusing primarily on deporting as many people as possible and prioritizing deportations for those charged with or convicted of a criminal offense. In addition to already living in over-policed communities, the recent executive orders by President Trump have significantly continued to criminalize the most vulnerable immigrant youth. These policies include the stripping of existing protections for unaccompanied minors and DACA youth, non-citizenship status as a crime in itself, punishable by deportation and detention. In addition, we've sought to force local jurisdictions and police to honor and enforce ICE detainees and hold requests. We sought to force jurisdictions to enter into 287G agreements that allow local law enforcement to act as immigration officers. We've encouraged states, and I say we loosely because this is not clearly who those of us on this call, this is really what President Trump has attempted to do with his recent policies. Encourage states to violate state confidentiality laws by sharing information with ICE. And what we're here to address amongst all of these other issues are the increasing reliance on locked detention as a strategy to deal with immigrant youth or justice involves immigrant youth. So our experts really are on this call. They're our speakers, and they're going to highlight the experiences that young people are facing, the work amongst legal service providers, direct service providers, lawyers, community advocates, policymakers, and the way all of these different sectors in our field are trying to work together to address the needs of our most vulnerable young people. We'll learn a little bit about the history and the current state of the detention system, the intersection between immigration and juvenile justice, the policies currently in place, the demands of community, and even the corporate interests fueling the expansion of the detention system. So I really look forward to hearing from all of them. The format will include a presentation by each organization and then a loose kind of question and answer conversation between myself and the presenters around the challenges and opportunities in store. And then finally, we want to open up the space for the broader community to mention their questions in the chat box or bravely unmute yourself and show us your face. We know that this is a long road ahead and it's going to take all of us, funders, grantee partners, community leaders, policymakers, folks in government, everyone who's on this call, even some of our board members, to continue to build the strong ties that it will require for us to change the tide and really protect our most vulnerable young people and communities. So just a quick housekeeping. In the chat box, we will be entering a survey that we want you to take prior to leaving the call. So I know we are all busy, amazing people out in the world doing great things. It would mean the world to us to hear from you and your feedback. So if you have to jump off, just take 30 seconds and click on the survey that Laura will be sending prior to leaving so we can hear about whether this format and this learning session experience has been useful to you. And also join our email list, affund.org. This is a place where you hear upcoming announcements, highlights from our grantee partners, the next iteration of our podcast, the announcement about our upcoming Education and You Shifting Justice Conference in collaboration with the Communities for Just and Fair Schools Fund, which we're glad to announce will be taking place in Puerto Rico in October. So we're really excited to bring together our grantee partners and some funder sponsors for that. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to email me. And finally, we will be sending a link around with some of the reports and resources that our partners are sharing with you as almost a learning library. So feel free to save that link. It will be live for 30 days, and there you can download the various reports and toolkits they've produced to help advance this work. So I would like to start taking more of a macro view. And so I'm going to turn it over to Silky Shah, the Executive Director of the Detention Watch Network, a national network that is doing work around these issues. And Silky, hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I just wanted to, prior to turning to your PowerPoint, give the community a chance to see your face and hear from you. Can you tell us a little bit about the work of the Detention Watch Network, and particularly, how would you describe the history and evolution of the detention system and federal immigration policy overall? how's the system organized and managed, and what are some of the things we're seeing around how young people are faring in this detention system?
Great, thank you. And I'm assuming PowerPoint will go up in a second.
Yeah, it will.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am really a fan of what Andrew's Family Fund does, and I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you about this. I think juvenile justice is something that we've not delved into as much, partly resources, partly in terms of like capacity and where people can put energy, but I'm excited to learn more on this call. So in terms of, here we go, a little PowerPoint. So I wanted to, yeah, I'll answer some of those questions that you had, Manuela. So in terms of DWN, we've been around for 20 years now. We celebrated our 20th anniversary last year. We started in 1997 after the passage of the 1996 laws, which really expanded who was being targeted for detention and subsequently expanded the detention system. And then, of course, after 9/11, we saw even more expansion, and I'll sort of get back into the history in a minute. But just to say, we became a formal membership organization in 2005. We have about 9 staff. Our main office is in DC, but we have staff, myself on the West Coast and some folks in Chicago as well. We are made up of about 80 member organizations. And so, you know, those include community organizations, you know, big national like the ACLU and, you know, American Immigration Law Center, Law Association, and different organizations like that, as well as directly impacted people who themselves have been in detention or their family members have been in detention. And, you know, we're really trying to bridge a gap around all the different strategies around detention. And ultimately, maybe we can go to the next slide now. And detention in the US. We adopted a vision of a world without detention in 2012, and we just officially wrote a new mission. So we're really trying to build power and work through our sort of collective strategies to end detention in the US. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll just start talking a little bit about the system, and then at the end talk a little bit about some of our campaigns. So just to give you a current sense of where the stats are, the average daily population for detention, for ICE detention right now, and this was just passed in the fiscal year 18 omnibus, is 40,354. That's just an average population. So at some point it can be 45,000, at some point it can be 38,000, but this is ultimately what the funds are. Trump requested 52,000 beds, and so we ultimately, while the numbers went up a little bit, they didn't go up as significantly as they could. And I think that was a lot of the organizing efforts that led to that. There are 205 jails in use for detention. Only 6 of those are owned and operated by ICE. So about 70% of people are held in detention centers that are run by private companies. And then the other set of 15% or so are subcontracted out to county jails. It costs about $133 per day to detain someone. That's not actually how much a county jail or a private facility would get, but just the scope of all the costs of transportation and et cetera, and ICE personnel, that's about how much it costs. A lot more for family detention. So there's about 3 family detention centers in the country right now in Texas and Pennsylvania. And that's how much it costs to hold somebody in those facilities because of all the additional services that need to be offered, though they're very limited and they're quite horrible facilities. So next slide. So just a little bit about the conditions of these facilities. 179 people have died in detention since 2003. We're actually putting out a report with Human Rights Watch, National Immigrant Justice Center, and the ACLU, follow up to a previous report that we did about the deaths in detention and preventable deaths. And what we found, and this is sort of, we're working out the stats right now, but roughly of 55 deaths that happened in the last few years, almost half of them were preventable in some way or another. And most of them could have been impacted by potentially better medical care. So really looking at the fact that, you know, because detention is essentially completely subcontracted out, we have a lot of facilities where people prioritize money as opposed to care. And so that's not just true for the private facilities, but also for these county jails where counties are totally strapped for funds and are looking to maximize their bottom line. Over 80% of people in immigrant detention don't have legal representation. They're not required to have legal representation. It's amazing to see that more people are getting that in New York. There's the universal representation effort there. And so it's great to see that that's happening, but it's still overwhelmingly people are detained in the South and Southeast, Southwest, and aren't getting the representation that they need. And also when people have representation, they're shown to be more likely to have a claim, have the ability to win their case. In terms of the egregious violations, as I mentioned, inadequate mental health care, egregious use of solitary confinement, no outdoor recreation. An example of a facility is Etowah in Alabama, where they say they have outdoor recreation, but it really is just a room with a window in it, and that people go into it for an hour a day. Video visitation only. People go, 3 hours to go see their loved one in order to see them before they are deported, and then end up in a video visitation situation where they can't even be there with them in person. Horrible food, labor with slave wages. So most people get paid $1 a day to work in detention. So I'm going to fast forward here. I only have a couple minutes left, but the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about, so just a trajectory, just to show that, expansion started happening even more after the Bush administration, after the creation of DHS. Obama actually took it to the next level. We saw a huge increase under his administration, an attempt for more transparency, but still an increase in detention. Now we're just seeing even more skyrocketing numbers under Trump. Next slide. So quickly on youth in detention. So we don't work on this area a lot, but just to say the way that it works is that if somebody is under 18 and they have an immigration violation or a question of their immigration status, usually they go into the custody of Office of Refugee Resettlement, which in these contexts of detention facilities are locked group homes. It's about 500 to 700. This was a few stats from a few years ago, so I'm not sure what it looks like right now. After turning 18, they're transferred to ICE detention if they're still in that situation, or sometimes people who are in juvenile detention facilities that have immigration status questions are transferred to ICE detention. And so that's a concern. The other way that people can get in is the case of Wilden Acosta, who was a 19-year-old who was targeted in North Carolina while he was going to school. And so for these folks who can't come in the last couple years, as soon as they turned 18, ICE was actually targeting them to go into detention centers. And so Wilden was actually held in the Stewart Detention Center. And there were 6 other cases in North Carolina similar to that people were fighting. And a big concern for youth is obviously lack of educational services inside. But in family detention, there's also this bigger concern around psychological impact of having your parent there, but having the guard be the authority figure. And we saw overwhelmingly kids are really losing weight inside these facilities. And I think that's a question of psychological impact. The next slide. So quickly, shifts under Trump, more expansion, rollback of a lot of Obama policies, faster deportations, but longer stays. And then an intersection of immigration proceedings and criminal prosecutions. This is just to say, things were bad. We gave the system in the hands of this horrific administration. They're just getting so much worse. Next slide. And this is almost the end. So, I mentioned earlier, we did a lot of efforts to cut funding for DHS. We didn't get to cuts in funding, but we did get 101 members of Congress on the record calling for cuts, which was huge. And we kept the numbers lower than what Trump was requesting. Also, we're trying to limit expansion through local site fights. So these places where they're trying to build facilities, we're working with groups on the ground. There's lots of litigation strategies around conditions. There's actually a class action lawsuit out of the Aurora Detention Center in Colorado, and now a copycat one at Stewart Detention Center, both private facilities. The one at Aurora has 60,000 people a part of this class action around the labor wages, which were $1 a day for the work that people did in detention. And we have this campaign right now called ICE on Trial, where we're doing tribunals at detention centers to really put ICE on trial and sort of bridge the gap between organizing and litigation, and the different strategies that we have right now to work on this. So the last slide is just to end on a hopeful note. We got 130,000 people to sign on to this petition for Defund Hate, which is calling for cuts in funding. And just to say, I think this is just a real opportunity for us to really have impact, because a lot more people are paying attention, and we can move the conversation even further to the left. So thank you so much, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Silky, for sharing the work of the Detention Watch Network and your 80+ member organizations. Now I want to turn to Angie Junk from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center to tell us a little bit about the work of your center and the forgotten youth caught at the intersection of the justice and immigrant rights. In the immigrant movement, what are the challenges that they're currently facing? What are the things that the juvenile justice reform movement hasn't yet caught on to in terms of the ways that we need to look for the changes that these young people need? So thank you so much, Angie, for joining us.
Thank you. My name is Angie, and I'm the Director of Immigrant Defense Programs at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Thank you so much for hosting this webinar. I don't think there's enough opportunities for us to talk about this intersection between youth justice and immigration. It's something that is not predominant in either space in the both youth justice or immigration movements. Our organization is a National Resource Center on Immigration Law and Policy. You could start at slide 2. And so what we do is really build capacity of whoever is working with immigrants, whether it be organizers, advocates, or attorneys, all the way to elected officials and law enforcement officials, to really promote equity and fairness for immigrants. And particularly pertaining to the topic that we're talking about today is we have been addressing the criminalization of immigrants and this intersection between immigration and criminal justice since the 1980s. And really what we're looking at doing is really exposing how immigrants are treated within the immigrant and in the criminal and juvenile justice systems on the front end, but also seeing how that contact with those systems then disparately impact them in the immigration system and lead to deportation and detention. Next slide, please. So in terms of just this moment, unfortunately, we are seeing unprecedented targeting of immigrants across the board. What is different about today than even a couple of years ago is not the fact that they're targeting people that have been in justice systems, but they're actually really, targeting people because of what they look like and for perceived illegality and criminality, right? And so we have this section now is that they can actually arrest someone that they think committed an act which they think was a crime. And so this is just a further blurring of what we have seen throughout history of blurring this idea of national security, migration, and public safety. And the way that it plays out today is that, the administration's argument is that like sanctuary cities is breeding MS-13, and MS-13 puts up a very clear image of a young man of like age 16 to 20, who's brown, Latino, probably from Central America, that is threatening everybody's public safety. And that's the image that's evoked, I think, every day. And these words are being used, gangbangers or wolves in sheep's clothing are some of the kind of allegations that are made against them. And the result is that all they have to do in this administration is allege that a young person is, a gang member or associate, and then basically the case is done in immigration court. Many of these young people are being deported en masse very quickly, and they're being redetained. And I think Rich later on will talk a little bit about some of these stories. Next slide, please. The way that this happens is that I wouldn't want to ignore that much of this criminalization doesn't necessarily stem from the federal government, although it's becoming very apparent. It actually does stem often from the local law enforcement level. It just takes an arrest. It just takes an allegation. It just takes a police officer saying someone is a gang member or associate and putting them in the database. It just takes a school resource officer, putting a note about someone's disciplinary history or saying, I saw X person with a gang associate. And unfortunately, that those allegations carry the scarlet letter. And they will follow these young people, and the Immigration Customs Enforcement or the federal government and any entity will run with that and say, you are already guilty, that evidence is enough for us to deport you. And so that's something that we're really looking at more deeply about how does this criminalization stem at the local level. The next slide, please. It becomes even worse when you see young people are detained in local juvenile halls. That's where you definitely see disparate treatment. And I just want to say, this is how we learned about this issue around juvenile justice and immigration, where we'd see young immigrant youth languishing in juvenile halls, even in places that were probably trying to move more alternatives to detention or progressive reforms, because immigration overrides what are best practices. And what you see is weakening the family, unit. You're undermining rehabilitation. You're exposing these young people to an additional trauma. And then on top of it, disproportionate punishment of being transferred to another juvenile hall that's supposed to be civil immigration, but actually looks like extended juvenile detention, where young people, sometimes I've known some young people sit in local juvenile hall for years, just on some underlying misdemeanors. It's pretty horrendous. And these probation officers will threaten families and youth to expose their immigration status. Otherwise, they say that they'll report them to ICE or report their whole families for deportation. So those are the kind of stories that we often hear. I want to just use the last few minutes that I have to just talk about the interventions and the innovative campaigns, how to address this. Next slide. There have been a number of intersectional campaigns that have emerged really from local organizing groups that have lifted up the stories of young people and their families who have been subject to this. And what that has resulted in community forums, media, video, as well as a clear policy agenda of going to local officials, both at the county level, to law enforcement itself, and really exposing these practices. And I think in many of these campaigns, this is the first time many of the law enforcement elected officials even knew what was happening or knew that that what they were doing wasn't the right thing to do. And in some places, we even found, like in one county, which was part of a reform effort nationally, they had paid someone full-time just to report young people to ICE. So these are campaigns to expose this treatment and to create more visibility around an invisible population in the juvenile justice system. If you could go to 2 slides over, here's another campaign. I think tied to this is just really the local and state policy reforms that we're looking for. Obviously, we're looking to change the system and the practices. And so we're really trying to look at equitable treatment of these young people, ensuring really holistic reforms take into account immigrant youth and don't leave them out of sentencing reform or other local reforms that are being moved. In the juvenile detention alternative initiatives, for example, Annie and Casey, we're looking at really ensuring that alternative incarceration means for all youth, not just some youth. We are looking at other reforms around confidentiality. We know that young people should not have their information shared, but unfortunately that hasn't been what's happening for immigrant youth. And that is a real danger because that leads to deportation. Next slide, please. The final thing that is really emerging, which has been so exciting, is the fact that there's a national debate about the need for school sanctuary. And when people talk about school sanctuary, they really are talking about trying to make sure ICE doesn't appear on school campuses to deport young people. But from what we've seen, the greater risk isn't that ICE comes to schools. The greater risk is school resource officers and school or other local police having a presence on campuses to report young people who then do work closely with the federal government. And there's a story emerging out of Houston that shares this. Dennis got into a school fight, and he reported himself to a school resource officer. Instead of the school resolving this, they reported him and took him to the sheriff's office, and he ended up in immigration detention for the last 3 months. His last year of his senior year in high school. He has 2 acceptance offers to 2 colleges to study computer science, and now he faces deportation to Guatemala, where he fears his life. And so what's amazing about this is groups like United We Dream, the largest undocumented youth group in the nation, One Houston, it's a group that's really fighting the school to prison pipeline. Criminal justice reformers are coming together to really think bigger, not just about an immigration solution, but to really think about how to actually size down and get rid of the Houston Independent School District Police altogether. So I'll leave that at that and share more resources later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angie, for lifting up the connections between the juvenile justice system and then the school to prison and school to deportation pipeline, which is a perfect segue actually for Natalia Aristizabal Betancourt, organizing co-director at Make the Road New York. So Nata, welcome. Just wanted to see if you could just tell us a little bit about these recent and growing waves of attacks. What do they mean for low-income youth of color in the public schools in New York City and a little bit further upstate, where I know Make the Road does do some of their work? In addition, can you talk a little bit about how do corporate interests intersect and what has Make the Road membership found in their organizing work? So we can't hear you, Nata. I don't know if your headpiece is, if the microphone is on. Oh, now you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you so much for having this webinar and holding space for this very important topic. So I'm going to be talking about the school to prison pipeline that Angie just alluded to. I will be also talking about the other general campaign work that we're doing. I think that one of the first things that I want to share with you is who we are. And then also if we can start the slide. So we're Make the Road New York, which is a community organization that is, can you go to the next slide, please? That is trying to work with community members in different ways. We have survival services, which aims to help people's immediate need, transformative education to make sure that they are being equipped with everything they need to be their best selves in society, community organizing, which is what I'm going to talk to you, and policy innovation. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about that. So we're going to, this webinar is to talk about this intersection around criminal justice, immigration, and juvenile rights. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is the school to prison pipeline. If you can go to the next slide. And the school to prison pipeline is the outcome or what happens when young people who are brown and black are continuously targeted by punitive discipline systems inside of their high schools, which instead of seeking to have some answers or alternative solutions around whatever discipline things are happening inside of the school, they get often suspended, or in New York City schools, and this is not specific to New York City, but often like arrested, right? Because there is a collaboration between the security guards and the police officers, and often the police officers are overseeing the security guards. Or in some high schools here in New York, you have a small precinct inside of a high school. So these practices about targeting young people, which are usually the suspension that's the most given to young people, predominantly black and brown youth, are like something equivalent to disorderly conduct or to not respecting authority, which can go from somebody had big baggy pants and we're told to pull them up, and he said, no, I want my pants like this, and that meant a suspension. And a lot of those will lead to you being suspended. And so this relationship that we call the school to prison pipeline, because what it does is push young people into the juvenile correction system also means detention for folks who, besides being targeted because of how they look, are also undocumented. And so I'm gonna also talk about a little bit about a case that we saw in Long Island recently, very similar to the case that Angie just shared, which is schools creating this list of like young people and who they are and what discipline they have. And so there's also the gang database, which is not new, but the way that it's affecting immigrant youth, it's a little bit new in the context that the president is obsessed with ending gangs, specifically MS-13, and has made Long Island a study case for this type of work. And so what we saw in Long Island with some of our members is that the school will put them in a gang, like an association gang database. And then from there, last summer, we saw ICE going towards those young people's homes because they have allegedly gang affiliation and trying to see if they're unaccompanied minors, undocumented, to pick them up and detain them. We are helping a lot of those young students and their families. We also had to fight a case of a young man who got a T-shirt in, I think it was JCPenney's. The T-shirt was a color, I think it was red. I'm actually not 100% sure of the color. And they associated that T-shirt with a gang, and the young man got detained, sent to Texas, was having a SIJ case application. SIJ is Special Immigration Juvenile Visa, which is a special visa given to young people who have certain conditions of either abandonment, hardship, abuse from one of their parents, and so they can apply to adjust their status. This young man was adjusting his status, and because the school thought that he was in a gang, he was then picked up and sent to Texas. We had to do a whole lot of advocacy to bring him here, and by here I mean back to New York, because also part of doing this is trying to figure out how we're going to help community members access lawyers, and lawyers will mean that the person has like 80% more chances of staying in the country than if they don't have a lawyer. And in New York, we fought really hard and advocated for a program that's called New York Family Unity Project, which what it does is defend anyone who gets detained and has to see, has to go for a master's or has to see their first immigration court here. As long as you're low income and you don't have a lawyer, you get protected. So that's one advocacy thing that we did that helps everyone, including young people. And so what we're doing is organizing high school students. The first thing is, and at the end of my website, you're going to see one report that was done by our youth organizing team in collaboration with the Advancement Project that talks about like the school to prison pipeline and some of the things that you can do to organize back in your community. But you want to make sure that young people are fighting back and are fighting so that the schools are trying to incorporate restorative justice practices rather than continue to have punitive detention practices. If we can go to the next slide, please. Then we also worked around having the DOE in New York City have a preemptive practice or action around what would they do if immigration goes to the high school. And again, as I was alluded to before, the major risk is when young people are are suspended or arrested inside of the schools, and then that like takes them to the detention system. But we also want to make sure that the high schools are sending a message to their community, which is the student parent community, saying we will not hand over a student to ICE. We did see a case in New York where it wasn't ICE, it was another branch of immigration, went to look for a fourth grader. And because we had asked the Department of Education in New York City to take a stand, that young kid was not handed over to immigration. And what this policy says in New York is that no principal can sort of interact with ICE, that it has to be the superintendent. And if ICE is present at a school, they have to call the superintendent. The superintendent has to then deal with ICE, and it's not the school that's directly dealing with them and handing over students. They additionally had to provide letters to all the families saying that your student is protected while they're in school, their rights. And now the DOE has been partnering with different community organizations in New York and with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to provide Know Your Rights to family members, so they're seeing their rights inside of the schools when they go to like the student-teacher meetings. And that's super important because one way to protect a young person and their families is that they need to know their rights. We also fought and just passed this in December, which is a resource bill that also says that no city employee can collaborate with ICE. We're working on the implementation of that. It's very similar to like the Trust Act in California. And there was also an executive order at the state level also saying that state employees cannot collaborate with ICE. And making those distinctions is important, because then that means that as advocates and as organizers, we can, if we see that someone was picked up because somebody called up ICE and said, hey, I just want to share this information with you, that we have tools to be able to fight back, and that in all these different agencies, whether school, healthcare providers, hospitals, whatever, they know that they have to protect the immigrants' identity. And then I'm just going to go to the last topic that I'm going to talk about, which is our campaign around corporate backers of hate. If we can go to the next slide. So this campaign, what we're doing is highlighting who are the people who are making money out of the detention of our folks, whether it's young people, whether it's parents, whoever it is, they're benefiting from incarcerating and detaining our folks. This is a continuation of the prison industrial complex. But actually the first place where people are detained that became private was a detention center, and then prisons became private. And so, as again was shared with us, and I think the next slide actually has it, is 9 out of like 10 facilities are a for-profit basis. So they are in the business of trying to detain people because they make money out of it. This, by the way, is an action that we did in front of the Chase headquarters, where we brought all the shoes in front of the headquarters of Chase, and we said, here are the shoes of the people, or these are representative of people who are being deported because you're making money out of the detention of folks. And so basically companies like Chase are invested in CEO and CCA, which are the private companies that detain folks. And I can't share it right now, even though I have the number, but we're going to release a report this week that talks about how much money they're making in shares and how this is a whole economic thing. We previously made a similar report around the wall and who was going to benefit from building a wall, and how this was a whole business model and project. So it's the same idea with the detention centers. This week we're going to publish a report that says how much money they're making in shares, and also how many people are dying inside of detention centers because the medical conditions that they have, or there is no medical conditions, or they're not treated well, therefore leading to deaths. If we can just go to the next slide, I think that's it. This is also a photo from that action. Here are some of the resources. Manuela can, for example, press on the wall report, and that will take you to the link where that report is.
That's great, Nata. Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, everyone, we'll be sending along a link with the reports and resources that everyone is sharing. So thanks so much, Natalia, for just highlighting the ways that the school to prison pipeline and the structures that are overly incarcerating our young people are at play, and facing the opportunity to go ahead and advance the agenda of ICE and Department of Homeland Security. And it's exciting to see the way that community has organized and supported school superintendents and principals to be able to push back and not collaborate with ICE and not collaborate with some of these more oppressive policies. Also to see how you have been providing community members and parents with the legal wherewithal to defend themselves. And we know that community can't do it by itself, right? So we're really excited to hear from Rich, who is taking the lead from community and providing legal representation and collaborating closely with Make the Road and other organizations as well, to really try to respond to the overwhelming need for legal representation faced by young people out in Long Island. So Rich, can you just talk a little bit about the Safe Passage Project and the specific legal challenges that young people are facing in Long Island, as well as a little bit about how you and city agencies and grassroots organizing groups and advocates are working to address the needs of young people?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Manuela. Thank you, Leticia, to the whole Andros Family Fund team for bringing us all together. I'm going to say that I'm in our basement offices, so give me a heads up if the connection starts to falter, and maybe I'll need to turn off my video just so you can hear me. But as long as things are going well. I should also say, especially because you asked us to talk a a little bit about collaboration, Manuela. How wonderful it is to be on a call with Silky and Angie and Natalia, because Detention Watch Network, ILRC, Make the Road, especially out on Long Island in particular, really important partners for Safe Passage Project and for the work in general. So very briefly, Safe Passage Project is an immigration legal services organization. Our vision is that no child should have to face the immigration process alone. And we're an organization that frankly wishes we could be a narrow, local, direct service organization, but we're operating in a time where we have to have a broader policy, advocacy, litigation perspective on the world. We provide free lawyers to 714 children who are living in New York City and out on Long Island, who are classified by the government as unaccompanied minors, which means they arrived in this country on their own, and who are actively being deported. They are in the middle of the removal process, and they don't have a lawyer by their side. And so we are an organization with 22 staff, 400 pro bono attorneys, and about a $2 million budget. And the key piece of data for our work is that a long-term study that's done out of Syracuse University has consistently found that when these children appear in court in a deportation proceeding, they have only a 17% chance of winning their case if they don't have a lawyer. And they don't have the right to a lawyer. So if they can't afford one or can't find one, they have a 17% chance of making it through. But the truth is the legal framework to support this particular set of immigrants, these unaccompanied minors, is actually strong. And so when they do have a lawyer by their side, they win their cases 85% of the time. At Safe Passage Project, we've typically won 90% of the cases in our portfolio, but it's night and day. So you can actually, you can stay on the first slide for the moment. So the same study shows that in New York City, in New York City and on Long Island, there are currently 2,000. It's a big number. It's a big number for us, and we only have 714 on our caseload. But it's not 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. In our area, there are currently 2,000 children who are going through the deportation process who don't have a lawyer. And so our particular mission over the next few years is to go get those 2,000 children and provide them with counsel. So briefly in terms of context, you can see this slide about what advocates call the surge. These unaccompanied minors really started arriving in significant numbers around 2013, walking, riding freight trains from Central America. They're leaving pretty horrific situations, and the trip itself is also incredibly challenging. You can go to the next slide. And the system they're released to is interestingly inconsistent. So I already mentioned that no one in immigration court has the right to a lawyer. That's something that's really important for everyone to understand. I know we have many experts on this webinar, but there may be some who are just coming to learn about the immigration system. Unlike the criminal justice system in the United States, if you've ever watched an episode of Law and Order, you know, we all know that if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. It actually turns out that in immigration court, that's not the case. Whether you're a 5-year-old or an 18-year-old, if you cannot afford a lawyer, you are expected to sit there at the defense side of the courtroom on your own with an adult government prosecutor on the other side of the courtroom arguing why you should be deported. On the other hand, the unaccompanied minors that Safe Passage Project focuses on do actually have multiple viable paths to citizenship. And so we heard Natalia talking about the SIDGE program, which is an opportunity created by Congress for these children to pursue green cards. And for children as well who are unaccompanied when they cross the border, they're detained briefly but are meant to be released to a caregiver. And so Angie talked about how the Office of Refugee Resettlement has some responsibility here. When you're a child who arrives in this country without an adult, if you say, you know, I know that my mom's cousin is living in Queens, New York, or my dad has a friend who lives out on Long Island, the government will actually make an effort to release the child to an adult caregiver once they do a screening. So there's actually some reasonably humane elements to the system. For these kids, the one challenge is the fact that they don't have a right to a lawyer. So let's look at the next slide. Life under Trump is not good. I'm not going to walk through all of these specific line items, but in particular, the immigration court is not actually a part of the judicial branch of the United States government, and it never was. The immigration court is not actually even called court. It's called the Executive Office for Immigration Review, and it's a department of the Department of Justice. So every one of those immigration judges who sits there in a black robe reports up to Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General. And in fact, especially over the past few months, Jeff Sessions has been exercising his right by law to be his own immigration Supreme Court. When someone appeals a decision from immigration court, it goes to something called the BIA, the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. And Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, is allowed to appeal the appeals to himself. It's as if Donald Trump was able to say, I don't like the decisions coming out of the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm going to take this one on myself. And so over the past few months, Jeff Sessions has increasingly identified matters of policy that he would like to change, particularly around the discretion that individual judges have. He's now arguing that judges shouldn't have the right to close immigration cases, that they should have to follow specific policies that come out of Washington, D.C., doing a whole number of policy changes that are incredibly challenging for the kids we serve. And so let's look at the next slide. And so, what I said at the beginning was we would have been much more comfortable at Safe Passage Project if we could have stayed in a narrow lane as a local direct service organization. Unfortunately, because of the increased challenges brought by this administration, it's no longer possible to support the children we serve with that local focus. And so because of that, we have had to increasingly fight for our kids at a much more national scale. So I want to tell one brief story about a boy named Arnold. Arnold arrived in this country, made an incredibly perilous journey by himself, walked essentially most of the distance between Central America and our southern border, took a freight train when he could through Mexico, and was protected under a number of those unaccompanied minor statutes. And so we met Arnold a couple of years ago. He was known to the government, fully registered, his address, he has what they call an alien ID number, and was living with a family member out on Long Island. And we were making progress in his case. The local court had found that he had in fact been abandoned by a parent, which is one of the requirements of pursuing his green card. Last spring, Arnold walked out of his house, walked down a few blocks, and was arrested, bundled into a car, and flown to a private detention center in Northern California in the middle of the night. No one knocked on the door of his home to tell his relatives that he had been taken. No one called us as his lawyers to say that he had been detained. And so we didn't know where he was. His family member who he was living with thought he might be dead. He thought he might have been a victim of the MS-13 gang. Well, one of the challenges as we sought to figure out how do we get Arnold back home was that the government was arguing not only did they not need to offer any proof of criminal behavior or criminal activity, that the government could just say, we have allegations that he's a part of a gang, that's enough for us to detain him until we deport him. But in fact, the government was making a particularly challenging legal argument that Arnold didn't even have the right to a hearing. So in other words, they were claiming that we couldn't even make the case that we should go before a judge to argue why he should be released. And so in partnership with the ACLU of Northern California, Arnold became the main plaintiff in a national class action lawsuit called Saravia v. Sessions. And ultimately, we won that case. Arnold was released from detention, but not only that, his case became a precedent that affects hundreds of other children all across the country. And so now in the immigration system, there's actually something called a Saravia hearing. And so when a child has been detained, they call it re-detained because these kids were detained for the first time when they crossed the border. But when a child has been re-detained, at least that child has a right to a hearing where their attorneys can make the case why they ought to be released back to their family. And so this was an example of where our very local direct service organization is increasingly looking to beef up and flex our muscle in terms of a national litigation advocacy strategy, and is doing so with partnerships with great organizations like, for example, the ACLU of Northern California. In terms of partnerships, and Manuela, I know you asked about this in particular. One very special thing that we have an opportunity to be a part of. Safe Passage Project exclusively serves children in the city of New York and out on Long Island. And that is essentially a tale of two cities. In the city of New York, there is philanthropic support, there are partners to work with. Out on Long Island, it's a very different story. But in New York, we are part of a coalition called the iCare Coalition, where a funder collaborative came together with a group of 5 agencies and made a commitment in 2015 to try to provide free lawyers to as many of these children as possible. And we haven't always kept up with the funding, with the number of kids arriving, but the number of children who receive full legal representation in New York City is higher than in any geography, as a proportion, higher than any geography anywhere in the country, because of this really powerful collaboration between the agencies and between the philanthropists and funders who made it happen. So I'll pause there so that we can have a good and robust conversation, but I appreciate the chance to tell our story a little bit.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rich, for sharing the work of Safe Passage. And now we want to do a quick round with all of the presenters to talk a little bit about both the challenges and the opportunities in store in regards to your particular work and what we're seeing on the political and national context or at the local level. So I want to start with Angie. If you could address both some of the challenges in regards to doing the work, as well as an opportunity or some opportunities that you think you'd like to highlight. I would love to encourage each of you to take no more than 2 minutes to discuss both, and I apologize. And only because we want to open the floor up to the other participants on the call. So, and this can be a little bit more informal. So go ahead, Angie.
I'd like to make 2 points. I guess the first one is that a lot of the immigrant rights debate has been focused on DACA and Dreamers, and really there's been invisibility about a lot of the vulnerable populations of young people that are exposed to the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system. And I think that not paying attention to those issues does hurt the movement overall because it furthers the criminalization of all youth. We're seeing documented youth now also being targeted for those. And I think related to that is, our resistance right now is really focused on, and where we have power is local and state level. And we have to consider how the local and state work is often juvenile justice reform. It's not immigration reform. And so how do we really kind of take on juvenile justice reform as an immigration reform issue at the local level and think more holistically? And I think there's just so many tremendous advances in the juvenile justice realm, from raise the age, ending direct file, sentencing reform, that we're not taking enough advantage of to look at how we can really stop the criminalization of all youth, including immigrant youth. And then I think the other thing is just, it's a question of resources and ability. I think we talk a lot about intersectionality, but it's really hard if there's not the resources for us to come together, to work together, to learn from one another. I think that we can differ on like what it is we're fighting against or different pieces. They are linked, but working together, I found that there are some common visions for what we all want, and the folks that are most impacted often have those commonalities aligned. And so I think that we could build a lot more together at policy and local organizing if those opportunities present themselves. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Angie. And Natalia, if we could turn to you to talk a little bit about both the challenges and the opportunities in terms of where Make the Road is in regards to your work.
Yeah, so the challenges is that we do not have enough people and resources for all the work that we can possibly be doing. The opportunities is when things are bad, it's a good organizing moment. When things are good, it's hard to tell people why they need to organize. So on this, we continue to organize around Long Island and trying to figure out how to fight back the gang databases, how to fight back the sheriff interactions with ICE, how to fight back around the fact that there was a recent contract. I think Rich alluded to some of this work when he was speaking. But there's, like a recent contract around beds that are now set aside in Long Island for immigrant youth, and we are pushing back to try to make sure that those beds are not there. And this is the county getting money from ICE to say, like, this jail is going to have 120 beds for immigrants. And so we're going to make sure that we don't put anybody else but immigrants. We are trying really hard to get ICE out of courts. We're trying really hard to fight back in New York City to try to make sure that, I think, like Angie alluded, that the issues around young people are fought for and changed. Like, we've been fighting for raise the age. We've been fighting to stop the criminalization of young people inside of schools. I think in this moment, it's also really hard when you have like massive shootings inside of schools to have a conversation that says, like, actually we shouldn't have metal detectors and we shouldn't have police inside the schools, because there's now another like really strong group of population saying, like, we need schools to be safer, but safer doesn't always mean is the best for our students. And I think most importantly, we need to fight as much as we can the good versus the bad immigrant narrative. And that is not only in the press, but that's also in the conversations that we have and the money that we fund. Because when we give money and we say, we want you to help this many people do this many things, either adjust status or do this great thing, sometimes it doesn't help us with the cases that are the hardest, that will take us the longest to, like, sometimes fighting for one case, for one young person, will create a precedent, or will help us push the line and say, this young person, if it wasn't because there was resources, legal resources, to fight an extremely hard case that maybe had gang association or something, that person wouldn't have been, say, back into society or able to go to college. And those cases are often the ones that take the most time and the ones that are worth like pushing forward, because they just push the envelope. And I'll leave it there so that we can hear from Silky and Rich.
Great. Thank you so much, Nata. And just Karen, thank you so much for typing in your question into the chat box. I want to encourage our participants to go ahead and type in your questions. After this popcorn round, we're going to go to the questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So Silky, can you talk a little bit about both the challenges and the opportunities in store for the work?
Sure. I mean, I think it was interesting just hearing Angie and Natalia speak, because I actually think it's sort of this intersection of, we've had an immigrant rights movement in this country for several years now, over a decade, where the push has been this like good versus bad immigrant narrative, and we're combating that even more now. I mean, we've constantly been combating it. Obama really fell into that. Trump is just in this like visceral hate moment. And so we're still negotiating that in terms of who's being affected by detention, families, adult, youth, everyone. But I actually think there's an opportunity for this conversation, because a lot of the folks in this conversation are focusing on youth who are targeted, by the criminal justice system. And so I think there's like a bridge here that can kind of get away from some of that, traditional dreamer narrative. DACA narrative is like no fault of our own, or we didn't do anything wrong and we deserve this. And actually like look at the way these, youth are being targeted. And I guess for Detention Watch Network, one challenge is, it's definitely resources. We're all going to say that. But I do think there is less information actually about youth in detention and how they're sort of getting into the detention system. We know how they are, but like, what are the numbers? Where are people being held? what are the impact on those youth? We have these like specific stories like Wilden Acosta, but an aggregate of information, I think, helps us better know what we want to push for and what our demands should be around this. And so I'd say that's a challenge and something that we want to do more work on. And then just the other thing I would just name is, you know, there's so many resources in New York. As a former New Yorker, like I love, I mean, it's really taught me so much. And in California, but like I think a lot of these places where detention centers are, there's like very little resources in the Deep South, in the Southwest, et cetera, and some of these growing populations in the Midwest. And then lastly, yes, it's an opportunity. I mean, for us to get 130,000 people to sign on to a detention petition was amazing. And I think it's a testament to the fact that this is the moment to really be diving in and pushing ourselves even further to what we really want to see.
That's great. And before turning to Rich, Silky, can you just mention a little bit on the experiences of your partners that are based in the Deep South, the Southwest, or the Midwest, and what are the things that they're seeing in their work?
I mean, I think ultimately, you know, I think there's just this sense of just complete lack of resources in fighting these facilities. So, you know, the idea that a universal representation program would happen in other places where people have lawyers. I mean, for the most part, people don't have resources. There's not as much capacity to, like, these facilities are in very remote locations, really hard for people to get to. And yeah, I mean, I think capacity is really, like, what we say capacity all the time, it's really people. It's like having more organizers, having more, I mean, yes, lawyers, but also organizers to really build up the organizing to combat what's happening at these detention centers. Yeah.
Sure. And then in regards to like trying to see parallel policies or efforts like Make the Roads in terms of the organizing that's happening on the school to prison pipeline work and the lifting up of restorative justice. And like Angie mentioned, you know, restorative justice or alternatives to incarceration for all young people, that in itself is yet layers and layers of additional work.
Yeah, there's so much to be learned. So how can we, you know, amazing models by Make the Road or Safe Passage Project, and like transfer those skills and those resources to other places in the country.
Right, and then the training up also of like the service providers, the legal providers, which I know Angie's organization does a lot of great work in. There are ways where best practices are not being promoted and lifted up and shared amongst those first frontline workers. And so that in itself is a need that I've heard you all express. Rich, can you talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, gladly. And so, yes, right, checks can be made to my attention and sent to the address you find on our website. No.
Or like you mentioned, red Converse sneakers.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I'm all about the kicks. You know that, my brother.
Okay.
I know, and I'm wearing a tie. I think that there's actually an important overlap between two of the really key points that even Natalia, Angie, and Silky were just talking about, which is itself an opportunity. So one thing is there is absolutely not only a risk of the good immigrant, bad immigrant, or just different groups within the immigration rights community being pitted against one another, but that's an explicit strategy. When the president released a 2-page memo out of the White House a couple of months ago that was his list of requirements in order to enact a DACA deal, ripping out the legal protections for unaccompanied minors was on that list. But even years ago during the Obama administration, the notion was that a deal for documented kids had to come at the cost of their parents, right? Which was never acceptable. And so, the opportunity there is to really continue to build these partnerships among all of our organizations. And I do think that even compared to some other social issues in the United States, the immigrant rights community, defined broadly, is actually one of the more fragmented communities in terms of funders, nonprofits. There's so many of us that have fewer than 25 staff that are doing this work. It's hard to kind of name the 2 or 3 big organizations that have fingers everywhere. And I think that can be a real strength, but it certainly takes a community organizing perspective. It takes work like, as Detention Watch Network does, to bring 80 different organizations together. So that's a real opportunity, and it can help remind us to not get tempted to cut some of those deals where one piece of the community has to pay a price in order to support another piece of the community. Another opportunity and challenge, I think, is more broadly around morale. So just even in terms of thinking of my colleagues here at Safe Passage Project, I've never in my life worked somewhere where literally 2 times a week a front page story in the newspaper or on television news was something horrible about what I do for a living every day. I've always had to dig a little deeper into the newspaper to find the bad news. And so, for the funder community, for the direct service, for the, advocacy community, there are also challenges about reminding each other that small wins are possible. And they are. We are winning cases. We are developing new materials. We are creating partnerships. In our small way at Safe Passage, we got 2 envelopes in the mail last week that were grants of asylum status to 2 of our clients. And that is an amazing, life-changing thing for 2 children who are that much closer to having a permanent, stable immigration status in this country. And so I also think that, while it's an important moment to sound the alarm, to bring new allies to the cause, it's also really important to keep reminding people that even now, even in one of the worst situations in recent memory, we're also still winning every day. I think that's a key opportunity to remind folks that. I already spoke about the power of collaboration. I think there are many, many more opportunities for funder collaboratives, agency collaboratives, Long Island in particular, but all across the United States. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Rich, for your thoughts on this issue. Can we, you actually set up a perfect segue to one of the questions in the chat, in the group chat, which was, and I'll turn to the women on the call. How have you all seen some of the work that you're doing intersect with the targeting of violent extremism in Muslim communities and Muslim youth in particular? Are there any intersections or connections in the work that you've seen? So Silky, Angie, Natalia, what are you seeing as connections?
I mean, I think that part of the reason why it's hard to answer this question is that this is an inherent problem with funding, which is okay, you're in your lane. We're the if you're working on immigrant rights, you're working with Latinx folks. If you're working on criminal justice, you're working with Black folks. If you're working on national security issues, you're working with Muslim South Asian folks. And so I feel like it's tough to say. I mean, I think, and there hasn't been as much of a bridge, at least on our end, as much as we'd like for there to be. I do think that in moments where, especially where you have more, immigrants beyond the sort of Central America area, you have a lot of terrorist provisions that are used to target people for detention and deportation, and the expansion of those are just increasing the number of people being impacted. But I'm not sure if there's much else I can offer there.
Sure. And so some folks asked if we could repeat the question a little bit. I think the original question had to do with executive orders and federal policy and national sentiment that seeks to counter violent extremism, and how that's related to this work around the intersections between juvenile justice and immigration systems. So, for example, I've heard some of our partners in Minnesota talk about specific federal programs to monitor and label Muslim communities and Muslim youth as potential targets for extremism or violence, and what that does in labeling them and setting up the infrastructure that is over-policing yet again in other ways different communities. So what might be some of the lessons learned from these different movements, and how can we as funders support this cross-movement sharing?
Yeah.
Angie? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I just wanted to say, I think maybe this, everyone here knows this already, but I feel like what's happening with either executive orders or rules, right? Because now I think that the current administration has understood or learned that there is like an easier way to fight back when they do an executive order than when they change rules. And we are seeing that that's also happening. Is that they are creating a state of fear and chaos in which the only solution is either, I don't know, believe this or vote for that. Like they scare you, and then they shove down a narrative on you, right? Which is why a lot of people believe that whole good immigrant versus bad immigrant. If you're like brown and young, you must be in a gang. Like people believe that, right? And so I think that what we're seeing is an attack to all of our communities. When they do it in executive order, we can organize, we can fight back, we can litigate. When they do it behind the scene, it's really up to the folks who have access to policy or lawyers. They take it and they keep it away from the public view. And for example, like I'm waiting for a change of rule around public charge, which will come down soon. It's been leaked now for a year. And public charge, what it's going to do is expand sort of how immigrants are seen as a cost to the country, as a burden to the country, and say that because their kids had access to food stamps or their kids had access to certain services because they were born here, if the parents is undocumented and they'll have a chance to adjust their status, they won't be able to if public charge rule changes. Because they're trying to say that anything that the parent wasn't able to provide for the kid will be enough of a proof or evidence to say that they don't have economic well-being to stay in the country. So I'm using this thing that hasn't happened yet, but that we're getting ready to respond to say, like, they are trying really hard to make this whole story about how we are like not supposed to be here. And by we, I mean immigrants. And I mean, not only Latinx folks, because I think Cynthia made a really good connection around like how issues are seen by like specific either ethnicity or race. And they're trying to make all these cases about like the other, and about the other is dangerous, the other is a charge to us, the other is inconvenient, and the other is stealing our either jobs, culture, and just for folks to know that it's really hard to fight that narrative. And so part of our job, besides organizing, litigating, providing legal services, whatever it is that we all do, is also staying atop of the public narrative about our communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Nata. And Angie, I wanted to turn to you because you've done, you mentioned something earlier in your presentation that I would like to flag. I'm not sure if you want to respond to this previous question or if I can ask you.
Next question, and I can see.
Okay, you weave it in. You said something earlier that I thought was really powerful. You said for whatever reason, immigration is overriding best practices in regards to the ways that we're treating young people. And also that some of the policy reforms or just business as usual right now is undermining family, separating family, undermining the wellness of immigrant youth in the system. And so can you talk a little bit, having worked from a perspective of training providers, doing litigation, working on the policy front, what is it that is we would need to reorient us to lift up wellness and best practices to service these young people, either on an infrastructure level, on a collaboration model level? What do you think it would take to turn us back into the things that we're hearing in the juvenile justice reform movement, which have not been easily won? I think we all know that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the conversations I've had with other juvenile justice reformers that have worked on hard issues of why we don't talk about girls so much in the juvenile justice system. Why don't we have data on Latinx like youth in the system? There's like no data there. Or why are we always kind of separate LGBTQ issues? And I think one of the things is just starting to have a more holistic conversation, not these conversations in a room on the side as if those young people aren't impacted by the larger system itself. And so I think that that's what tends to happen. And we've done some intersectional things like, look, these are some of the most vulnerable youth that we need to take into account what the issues that they're facing and not just kind of silo them. So I have felt like, at least on the immigration point, is that unfortunately, yes, there are some people that are malicious in like law enforcement. They're like, this is a way that we're going to get rid of gang youth. We're just going to dispose of them and call ICE. We don't have to deal with them. They're not going to be our problem. So we do have those folks, but there's a lot of folks that just don't understand the lack of education. It is astounding how media or just reading an article can determine a policy or a practice in law enforcement. And that's what we have started seeing, where they'll just spit out myths of like, well, we had to work with the federal government. We had to call them. And it was like, wow, you have these principles that clearly said we're going to treat all youth. The best outcomes for them is to be with their family. And they said, but we knew the federal government wanted them. We had to hold them. And no one asked a question. No one did anything. And so I think just having these conversations, we know when we talk about bias and just create awareness around that people are more sensitive to actually what that might look like. And I think it's also equipping folks with some of the more resources of even where to get the information at the local level, not to be scared of this conversation. Immigration is so political that people are like, nope, we're not going to touch that, but to make it okay at different levels to actually come out and discuss this, because these are issues that we're grappling with. And then I think just about the Muslim question, we have worked less on this. Again, it's like there's so many different sides of these issues that it's so hard to address all of the different things that come up. But I think another blind spot that we're having and a lot of people don't focus on is surveillance. It's something that we don't understand that well. We know it's happening. It's light years ahead of us. The federal government is very intersectional, right? They're working with law enforcement, moving so many different kinds of tools that, who is it going to apply to next? I mean, they're building these tools to apply to multiple segments of our population. So it's something, again, where I think that we can do a lot of cross learnings also with juvenile justice and others that have been working more on that end and seeing how information flows to address kind of the issues that are facing all these communities.
Can I also just add something on to that surveillance piece? I think in the context of immigration detention specifically, I think we think about, okay, there's 40,000 people in detention at any given time, but beyond there's actually 70,000 people under some form of alternatives to detention, which we often call alternative forms of detention, like GPS monitoring. And I do think that as we see the system grow, as it's already grown, these sort of different versions of surveillance, other strategies to really target, immigrants generally, and maybe vulnerable populations. It's easier to put for family detention. They're putting people on ankle bracelets really often whenever they're coming out. And so I think it's something that's important to keep an eye on, as Angie said, and just say, with ICE, for instance, they'll have over 100,000 people in some form of custody with alternatives and detention combined.
Great. And I think even though we don't have the best answers around this intersection around the targeting of Muslim communities and how it relates to the federal policies and what's happening with immigrant youth writ large, I will want to signal or point us to our colleagues at the Proteus Fund and Shireen Zaman. So I'm going to type her email into the chat box, but they are having a funder briefing on May 1st on the impact of Muslim bans in New York City. And this is yet another place where we should all continue to keep talking. There was another question from Karen, and Karen asks, have the conditions of confinement litigation been utilized at all in fighting family/juvenile immigration detention? So I am not aware. But I don't know if someone can take this question.
I want to share two things that I'm thinking about where litigation has been super important, and I don't know if that's what you mean by the confinement of litigation, but one is when the attacks started coming to the immigrant community, we put forward a lawsuit. This goes all the way back when DAPA was a thing. So the expansion of DACA was DACA Plus and DAPA. DAPA was about the parents. When we knew that DAPA was going to be attacked by executive order, we put a lawsuit in place to say like, oh, the hardship that you've done to parents, but then that kind of like went down really fast because of like the courts and all of this. And but we still kept our lawsuit in place because we had a fear that DACA was going to be attacked. And then surely enough, actually our case, to be more exact, was around DACA Plus, and the people who had already received an expansion of their DACA, a work permit that was 3 years instead of 2, and had to return it to immigration. That was kind of like the arguments for our lawsuit. We kept it in place because we're like, we think DACA is going to be attacked, and then it was. And our lawsuit was one of the first placeholders to say to use litigation as a way to find an executive order. Fast forward to now, both the California case and the New York case have helped to say that people who have DACA can continue to reapply. But unfortunately, no new applicants can apply. But that, I think, is one specific example of where using the courts helped out the fights around the organizing and helped keep something that we have for the immigrant community. Litigation hasn't always been the best, but it has at least helped for this one case. The other thing that I'm thinking is not specifically like a lawsuit, but yes, our lawyers being on their tippy toes and making sure that we're pushing back every time we're having outcomes in the courts that are not necessarily the best for our communities. So back to SIJ, I explained it before, the special immigration juvenile visa. In New York, we had a case that we were representing as Make the Road, where the judge said that they were not going to adjust your status as an immigrant youth, you have to go to family court, and you have to prove in family court that you have a parent or a guardian. And so that family court judge said that a guardian that was undocumented cannot be a guardian of a young person. So what we did is that we appealed and we fought back. And so at fighting back, we were fighting not only for that immigrant youth that we were representing, but we were fighting for all the youth who can potentially be getting denials in family court about who their legal guardian can be. Because once you go through that and you get your legal guardian, you get like special findings, I think is the term, and then from that you send that to immigration and adjust a young person status. So we were able to fight back, and then now in New York there is family court order that says that immigration has nothing to do with your ability to provide care to a young person. And that's like one moment again where just our lawyers being like willing to fight and appeal whatever's coming out of the cases is keeping something that's essential for young people to adjust their status.
That's a great example, Nata, of some of what you all mentioned when we were on the planning call first, which is that there are these like infrastructural kind of loopholes in terms of who has the authority to speak on juvenile justice issues and reform writ large versus where are immigration policies and implementation, where is that housed? I was wondering if someone could talk really briefly about just, you know, the challenge of your fight as you're addressing the intersection of these two systems in terms of who has authority over some of these decisions, and also the way these loopholes are created so that you have to not only litigate or like argue or advocate for the citizenship status of a parent as an authorized legal guardian, which has implications for like where kids can be and who can take care of them. Just maybe any closing thoughts around what you foresee in the future as additional either challenges or opportunities around the way this landscape plays out. And I think, Angie, you had mentioned this earlier too about why it's so hard to kind of work at and the way these policies are coming down the pipe.
I'll just speak to some of the legal. I haven't talked as much about that, but I think there are just some really innovations that we can think about in the legal realm. And just going to the question that you said before, there was an agreement, it was called the Flores Settlement Agreement, that was filed by Youth Law Center. They're a juvenile justice reform group. I know NICL, National Center for Youth Law, is monitoring this settlement, as well as the Center for Human and Constitutional Rights, about the conditions of confinement around the country and how children need to be treated as children and not as adults. Unfortunately, there's some still exceptions there that allows them to hold people when they're young people if they're public safety threats. And I think that the immigration litigation has not kept pace with what has happened in juvenile justice movement and those reforms. So I think it would be amazing to see if there are some more additional challenges that could be made. And I know the ACLU did do a challenge around redetention in Rich's case that he described of Arnold, who was redetained And there are actually no processes. There were no processes. When you go to detention and you're a youth, there is no bond hearing. They just say, well, the government decided this, and that's a decision. And so what we're doing is creating innovative strategies to say, we're going to challenge everything. You ask for a bond hearing. You file what we call motions to suppress information. If we know that there have been state violations or other violations by law enforcement with gang databases, we have to assert everything we can. So I think that it does take resources though and some ingenuity to do that, but I think that that's where we actually, in this time, despite all the bad news, is we are winning in the courts in many cases, and we need to continue to do that.
Fantastic. So with that, we will leave it there, Angie. I want to thank all of you for participating on this learning session. Everyone, please kindly turn to the group chat and fill out the SurveyMonkey link. It'll take you no more than 30 seconds, I promise. We've also included the link for you to access the reports that our phenomenal partners have published out in the field. Please do visit that site and download all those reports and build on the collective learning. We've also included the link to sign up to our email list, and Jen will now put up the PowerPoint so you have the contact information for all of our speakers, our presenters. So please do take note of it. Once again, thank you all for joining our learning session. The next one will likely be in July, where we will be looking at some of the work of local and national partners who are trying to open up vehicles for young people to stand in stronger economic resiliency through workforce development projects, through youth social enterprises, and other really important initiatives that are helping young people exiting the justice and foster care system access some additional resources. So stay tuned for that and many other exciting programs. Don't forget to visit our podcast page. It's on our blog link on the AFF website. And all in all, thank you so much, everybody, for taking time out of your really valuable work to be here and sit with us and share information for funders while we're taking you away from the front line. So we promise to stop doing that right now and send you many, many blessings for your work. And thank you once again for joining us. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Be well.
Thank you so much, everyone.
No problem. Thank you all. Be well.